you're taking part in an initiative at Hatfield College that has two aspects. The first is you're part of our Shaped programme today. This is Shaped, that's our logo, and it stands for supporting Hatfielders' academic progress, future employability and personal development. And we try in the college to put on a series of events, colloquia, seminars, conversations, careers talks or whatever that help develop our students to promote their academic progress, their future employability and their personal development. And if you have something good, you like to share it and you like to help give it away. So from time to time we invite a wider group of people within the university to come and enjoy the SHAPE programme with us, to hear a lecture or take part in a seminar or colloquium. So there are lots of visitors here tonight. If you're one of them, we warmly welcome you and hope you enjoy it. And I know sometimes we do have the reputation of being a college that's a bit noisy, a bit sort of too sporty, and a bit sort of boisterous. Well, we are those things, but we're also a serious-minded college that wants to promote academic endeavour and personal development. So come and join with us in the good things. So that's the first aspect of tonight. The other aspect is I chair and facilitate an interdepartmental forum called the Forum on Forgiveness and Reconciliation. Forgiveness and reconciliation are particular research interests of mine, and they tend to bisect lots of different disciplines. So there's a huge amount of work happening in philosophy. There's a huge amount of work happening in political science, and there's rather less work happening in theology, but some work is. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to bring together a number of different departments in the university where they will have people working on forgiveness and reconciliation, pooling and sharing their knowledge and learning to help promote an interdisciplinary approach in which we all learn and benefit. Well, tonight is the first time that somebody from the Department of English is joining us, Professor Stephen Regan, who I think is known to very many of you. Stephen is a Durham-born lad. He's come back to his roots. He's taught at several British and overseas universities. And he came to Durham. He came back to Durham and joined the English department here in 2004. Previously, he was a lecturer in modern poetry at Royal Holloway University in the University of London, and he's also worked at Ruskin College, Oxford, and at the Open University. He was a visiting scholar at Harvard University in the Department of English, and he's worked for the British Council in Poland, the former Yugoslavia, Morocco, and Tunisia. And then he has a duty which is a great burden to him. It requires him to travel to exotic places and stay in lovely hotels and have fine meals and mix with the highest of the high. He is currently Chief External Examiner for the Arab Open University. I'd like to put my name down for post.
Not always that glamorous, not Instagram.
We do welcome you. He's here as an also-ran tonight. It's the number 2, it's the B movie, because his wife is our assistant senior tutor, and we're very grateful to her. And it's very good that you're here in the shadow of your wife tonight. So, without more ado, Stephen, the floor is yours to speak on forgiveness in post-ceasefire Irish poetry.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. It's a really great pleasure to be at Hatfield tonight. A great pleasure as well to be contributing to the excellent work that Anthony's doing with the Forum on peace and reconciliation. So thank you for your kind words, Anthony, and for the invitation. And thanks to all of you for coming along on a Friday night at the end of a busy week. It's early November, and of course this is a special time of remembrance, and it's a fitting time as well, I think, to think about the political conflict that raged in Northern Ireland for over 25 years, quarter of a century, and maybe we don't give enough thought to that. 3,500 people lost their lives in that conflict, the largest number being innocent Catholic civilians. But the announcement of ceasefire by the provisional IRA, the end of August 1994, was a cause for jubilation and optimism, with some scepticism and guardedness, but it was a supremely important moment in the history of that conflict in the north. And it was followed 6 weeks later by a similar announcement by loyalist paramilitaries. The effect was momentous and immediate. Within a few days of the IRA ceasefire at the end of August, British troops in Northern Ireland started wearing berets instead of helmets. Roads that had been closed for many years were reopened. There were visible signs within a few days. So a great sense of jubilation, especially in the city of Belfast. But understandable caution and scepticism as well. The peace talks stalled, some of you might remember, over the scrapping of IRA weapons, the so-called decommissioning of arms. And in the wake of that, sporadic violence continued. But there's no doubt that that ceasefire brought an end to large-scale political violence in the north. It paved the way for the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and the ensuing peace process based on shared structures of power. Now, it might seem that the world of poetry and the world of politics are far apart, but one of the first writers to respond to that IRA ceasefire announcement was Heaney, whose work we're going to look at tonight. And I've given you a short extract on the handout. You all have a copy of this. There are a few at the back if you haven't. Extremely important statement, written and printed in the Dublin newspaper, the Sunday Tribune, 4th of September 1994. So written very quickly, just a few days after the ceasefire. And it begins in a very positive mood. The announcement by the provisional IRA last Wednesday changed everything for the better, he says. And he goes on to say, just at the beginning of the next paragraph, I went outside to recollect myself, and suddenly a blind seemed to rise somewhere at the back of my mind, and the light came flooding in. It's a fantastic image of a blind at the back of his head being lifted, and the darkness of the political violence of the previous 25 years seeming to be swallowed by this blinding light. He says, I felt 25 years younger. I remembered what things had felt like in those early days of political ferment in the late 60s. But that feeling of being freed up, as he puts it, turns to anger as he ponders 25 years of suffering that have brought the situation to a point that's actually less politically promising than things were in 1968. Now, the reason he mentions 1968 is that October 1968 was the beginning of the civil rights movement, prompted in part, of course, by the civil rights movement in America. And we know now that Seamus Heaney took part in the civil rights marches as a student. So he's looking back to that point in 1968 where so much promise seemed to be in the air, followed then by so much violence and desolation. The year after this, 1995, Seamus Heaney received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in the prize acceptance speech that he gave, he speaks of acts of faith around the world that inspire a hope that a new possibility can still open up in Ireland as well. So still in a buoyant and optimistic mood a year later. Well, this complicated response to the ceasefire, and I think it is a complicated response, optimistic but also troubled and remorseful as well, provides us with a valuable starting point for tonight's lecture. And the question I want to ask is, has the peace process made any appreciable difference thematically or stylistically to imaginative literature in Northern Ireland since 1994? And I'll give you the answer now, just in case you want to leave. The answer is certainly yes. But there are shifts in mood and shifts in outlook that are often tentative and not easy to detect. And what I'm going to argue is that poetry is never simply or easily or passively reflecting the conditions of its making. It actively participates in, even helps to shape the climate of opinion, which helps to shape, bring about political change. Seamus Heaney, in that Nobel Prize speech I've just referred to, talked of crediting poetry. That's the title of his Nobel Prize lecture, crediting poetry for all that it helped to achieve in bringing about a peaceful settlement in his part of Ireland. Now, even before the announcement of the IRA ceasefire, Seamus Heaney was cautiously letting in the light, finding reasons to be sanguine and positive, and this changed mood is clearly evident in his 1991 book of poems, Seeing Things. It's worth reflecting on that title, Seeing Things, because I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, it suggests the importance of seeing things accurately, but it also suggests seeing things differently, imagining things, in other words, admitting a new visionary element into his work. And he begins to write about the need to credit marvels, to turn, as he says, from the murderous to the miraculous. And that change is powerfully registered in a very movingly personal and candid poem titled Fosterling that we're going to look at. In fact, we're going to listen to Seamus Heaney read it. If you've never heard Heaney read his work before, I hope you'll enjoy it. Even if you've heard him read before, I hope you'll enjoy it. For those of you not familiar with the old technology, I'd better explain this is a cassette player. This is a cassette tape. I predict that just as vinyl has made a great comeback, the humble cassette tape is going to make a comeback as well.
In our house, at least.
This is Seamus Heaney reading the poem Fosterling, which is on your handout on the first page.
Fosterling, that heavy greenness fostered by walking. At school I loved one picture's heavy greenness. Horizons rigged with windmills' arms and sails. The mill houses still outlines. Their in placeness, still more in place when mirrored in canals. I can't remember never having known the imminent hydraulics of a land of glower and glit and floods at Dailacon, my silting hope, my lowlands of the mind. Heaviness of being, and poetry sluggish in the doldrums of what happened. Me waiting until I was nearly 50 to credit marvels, like the tree clock of tin cans the tinkers make. So long for air to brighten, time to be dazzled, and the heart to lighten.
That title, Fosterling, is such an interesting and telling title. It's an archaic word, it's Old English, in fact, meaning foster child. And in part, I think this poem is a reflection on the difficulties of growing up, the difficulties of finding an independent voice amid so many competing languages and cultures and viewpoints in his part of Ireland. But the word also brings to mind a famous line from Wordsworth's Prelude, in which, contemplating the growth of the poet's mind That's the subtitle of Wordsworth's Prelude. Wordsworth tells us, I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear. Now this is a line that appeals very much to Heaney. I grew up fostered alike by beauty and by fear. He mentions it in a couple of places, including his book North, written at the height of the Troubles in 1975. But the fear that Heaney is alluding to is not the sublime fear that Wordsworth writes about, the sublimity of mountain landscapes and lakes and the darkness of the evening, but the fear of political violence in the north. And that word fostered is there as well in the epigraph. It's a quotation from another Irish poet, John Montague, but it also recalls one of the most famous lines in all of Irish poetry from W.B. Yeats's Easter 1916. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, a terrible beauty is born. There's no doubt that that heavy greenness that Heaney is alluding to is a recognition of the weight of responsibility, the weight felt by Irish poets coming after Yeats, and the weight of nationalist commitment and nationalist struggle. Heavy greenness, of course, is also a very apt description of the rural landscape where Heaney grew up and where many of his early poems are set. The child at school in this poem admires what appears to be Dutch landscape painting with the windmills, presumably because this is an imagery of work that's intimately connected to a landscape of earth and water, very like his own Irish bogland, of course. And that land, in turn, is a place of inspiration, and Heaney highlights the close association between place and poetry, between what elsewhere he calls the contours of language and the contours of landscape. In those old Irish words, possibly of Norse origin, glar and glit, one being wet mud, the other ooze or slime. This is a very boggy landscape that Heaney is alluding to. And we also have that old Ulster Scots word, dalligon, meaning twilight. In other words, the light that is daily gone. It's a beautiful word, old Ulster Scots. Now, this combination of languages and cultures in Northern Ireland in some ways is a very fruitful inheritance for any writer, but it's clear from what Heaney is suggesting here and elsewhere that it's also an index of conflict. It also points to the multiple competing languages and cultures that any writer in the North has to come to terms with. It's a cause of conflict and despair. Without being explicit, the poem reflects on the challenges and the disappointments of the preceding 20 years. My silting hope, my lowlands of the mind, a psychological landscape this time. Now, as all the ardent poetry critics among you will have recognised already, the poem is a sonnet, and we expect a sonnet to work dialectically. That is, an 8-line statement, the octave, followed by a 6-line counter-statement, bringing us towards some kind of resolution, often in the form of a closing couplet, and that's exactly what this sonnet does. In that sense, it's quite a traditional sonnet. The sestet turns us from heaviness to lightness, from earth and water in the octave to air and light. But it makes us wait, just as its author has had to wait for some sense of turning. And in contrast to Milan Kundera's unbearable lightness of being, what Heaney has experienced here is the unbearable heaviness of being. Poetry sluggish in the doldrums of what happens. In other words, attending always to the here and now of actual circumstance, which of course in his early work had been the ideal, that's what he'd aimed for, but by this time has become oppressive. It's now time to credit marvels, to believe in what might happen, to rediscover a childlike excitement in creative wonder. The tree clock of tin cans the tinker's made is an alliterative marvel of sound, and he packs so much into that line. The tree clock of tin cans the tinker's made. But it also reconnects this poem with the rural island of Heaney's youth. However derogatory that word tinker might sound, it's a reminder that Irish gypsies were tinsmiths. They were menders of pots and kettles, and that's where that word tinker comes from. And this tree clock of tin cans comes from a story that Heaney heard in County Wicklow about a fabulous clock built by the tinkers to ward off the devil who had come to collect the souls of the people. Now, some of you will know a famous play by W.B. Yeats, The Countess Kathleen, in which the devil makes a pact with starving peasants during the famine, hoping to collect their souls at the end of all of this. So Yeats is hovering around this, and Yeats is there as well with that line, air to brighten, because the brightening air comes from his poem, The Song of Wandering Angus, early Yeats poem. And the idea of a heart lightening at the end recalls his famous line in Easter 1916, his warning that too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. He seems to be alluding to this. But the really wonderful achievement of the poem, I think, is that as well as invoking Yeats, it invokes Shakespeare too in its closing couplet. And its closing couplet recalls especially Sonnet 18, so long as men have eyes and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So what the poem appears to be doing at one level is reconciling the claims of the great Irish nationalist poet Yeats on the one hand, and those of the great English poet Shakespeare, acknowledging Shakespeare's belief in the persistence and the durability of art itself. Well, the final word of that poem, Fosterling, is lighten. And this prompts Heaney to write a whole sequence of poems he calls lightenings, to do with letting in light, lightening up, especially in the aftermath of the ceasefire. And one of the most dramatic instances can be found in the poem The Skylight. This is the seventh poem in a sequence called Glanmore Revisited. Glanmore being the estate in County Wicklow where Heaney and his family went to settle after leaving Northern Ireland in the early 1970s. And he tells the story of how this came about. He'd gone off to Harvard where he was spending a semester each year. And while he was away, his wife Mary seized the opportunity to cut a hole in the roof of his study up in the attic against his wishes, and he came back and found this. I can imagine some choice poetry was recited on that occasion, but we have this great poem to be thankful for, and it's just called The Skylight. You were the one for skylights. I opposed cutting with the rhyming couplet, but the turn between the octave and the sestet this time beautifully coincides with the shift from stubborn resistance or opposition to grateful release. So the initial preference for the perfect trunk-lid fit of the old ceiling gives way precisely at the turn to extravagant sky and wondrous surprise. And it's well worth looking at the rhymes and what Heaney does with the rhymes this time, because he has these very sturdy alternating rhymes at the beginning of the octave, opposed, closed, and then this lovely run of tongue and groove rhyming with nest up in the roof. And these tighten into couplets, which is quite unusual. It's sort of like a premature turning to couplets in the octave. So you've got feeling, ceiling, hatch, thatch, as if there's a battening down of the hatches. There's a kind of resistance in the very rhyme pattern. But then the rhymes give way to the looser, more relaxed rhymes in the sestet. These very loose near rhymes, extravagant, inhabitant, open and forgiven. Very subtle rhymes, actually, palsy and away. Now, this letting in of light brings with it a powerful sense of healing and forgiveness. The poem alludes to the biblical parable in St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 4, in which a man afflicted who can't be brought in through the door has to be lowered down through the roof to be physically and spiritually restored. And I think this allusion reinforces Heaney's insistence on a poetry that now turns away from the murderous to the miraculous. And of course it suggests that healing is very much on his mind in these years, in the 1990s. Now, one of the most striking ways in which the Ceasefire shapes the later poetry of Seamus Heaney is in the way that it revisits places in the local landscape. If you've read Heaney's early poems, you'll know that there are many place names like Anhorish and Broke, some of them difficult to pronounce. Places of great significance, often because they're on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, or because they were originally Old Irish names that were changed by the British Army during the Ordnance Survey. And one of these places is a place called Toom in County Antrim. It's part of the Bann Valley, which is a great site for archaeological discoveries. Heaney's very interested in it for that reason, because it has to do with digging, reaching down into the earth to recover objects. But it's also a place associated with the Irish Rebellion of 1798, and in particular with a young Irish rebel called Roddy Macaulay, immortalised in song. My grandfather used to sing it. For young Roddy Macaulay goes to die on the bridge of Toom today. It's a very stirring song, despite being a song about someone going to their execution. But this song is alluded to. Heaney's aware of that. He's aware of how there's a whole culture surrounding particular place names. Now, this poem, At Toom Bridge, the final piece we're going to look at by Heaney, has to do with revisiting old haunts in a new light. And appropriately, it was the first poem published in a volume titled Electric Light in 2001. Electric Light is important because some of these poems are looking right back to the 1930s, 1940s, when bits of rural Ireland were electrified for the first time, including Heaney's grandparents' house. But I think also what it's suggesting is that after the ceasefire, there's an electrically charged atmosphere. I think possibly Heaney has in mind that great line from Hopkins, where he says, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It's as if the atmosphere now, there's something palpably exciting and different. And that certainly comes across in the poem. And a possibility of just seeing the world differently now in the aftermath of the ceasefire. So this is At Toom Bridge. Where the flat water came pouring over the weir out of Loch Ness, as if it had reached an edge of the flat earth and fallen shining to the continuous present of the Bann. Where the checkpoint used to be, where the rebel boy was hanged in '98, where negative irons in the open air are poetry to me, as once before the slime and silver of the fattened eel. Well, here he returns to a place that, as I say, has strong associations both with historical memory, with the rebellion of 1798, and with events in the aftermath of the ceasefire, where the checkpoint used to be. Things have changed, things have moved, where the rebel boy was hanged in '98. Now, both of these events appear to be receding in this electrically charged atmosphere, in which the poet senses the possibility of the marvellous in the shining water of the River Bann. There's a very clever slippage in that closing line, from slime to silver, not sliver, as we might expect, since it's a reference to eels, the slime and silver of the fattened eel. Now, what are eels doing there? Well, eel fishing takes place on Loch Ness, and Heaney had written about this before. There are poems in his second book, Door into the Dark, about eel fishing in this part of Ireland. But there's a very clever subliminal connection between electric light, the title of the book, and electric eels, because the eels themselves possibly a source of charge, some kind of electric charge. But what's also interesting now, I think, is that there's a new playfulness. That's typical of the playfulness of the later Heaney, and a new kind of stylistic freedom. If we compare this with very early Heaney poems that many of us know, poems like Digging, Between My Finger and My Thumb, The Squat Pen Rests Snug as a Gun, there's something strangely teasing and quizzical and cryptic in these lines. The typographical indentation of the poem is odd. Syntactically, it seems disconnected. It doesn't actually have any grammatically correct sentences in it. The impression is that it might have been lifted from a larger sequence. So stylistically, it's playful and experimental, doing something different. Something interesting happens with the movement of water from the flat water, and there are optical illusions making us once again see things differently. But that movement of water sets up a very complex interplay between spatial effects and temporal effects, just disorienting us for a moment, I think. It's as if it's seeking out verbal and grammatical equivalents for the geographical features of the Bann Valley, as with the continuous present of the Bann, which is both a verbal and grammatical description, the continuous present, but the continuous present of flowing water as well. And the repetition, what we might call the anaphoric repetition at the beginning of the line, where, 4 times in a poem of just 10 lines. It's a strong indication that this is a poem concerned with revisiting and reassessing places charged with personal and political significance. So I would see it very much as a key poem of the ceasefire, post-ceasefire years, really indicating that things have moved on. There's a different worldview and a different set of techniques and styles to go with it. Well, I want to move on now to some of the other poets, and in particular now Michael Longley, close contemporary of Seamus Heaney, and the poem Ceasefire, which is the poem in the very middle of your final page there. A poem titled Ceasefire, published in the Irish Times, again a little like Heaney's very rapid response, just 3 days after the IRA ceasefire of the 31st of August 1994. But even though the title and the date of publication immediately suggest its contemporary relevance, its subject matter is from classical epic, particularly the writings of Homer. It's from Book 25 of the Iliad, in which Priam, the Trojan king, goes to Achilles to request the dead body of his son Hector. Longley emphasises a shared humanity in the tears of the 2 men, but also, I think, an unexpected gentleness that he perceives in the midst of war. And this clearly is a poem of forgiveness and reconciliation for its own time. But in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and for the old king's sake laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done. and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. Once again, it's very interesting, isn't it, how the sonnet's form is brought into play with its dialectical progression and its intricate patterning. It's almost as if the sonnet is a poignant, condensed vignette selected from the vast epic treatment of war in the Iliad and focusing closely on this moment of forgiveness and reconciliation. This time, the parts of the sonnet are numbered, so we can see this time 3 quatrains and a couplet. And there is an element of narrative, an element of storytelling, derived, of course, from epic literature. But I think also what this numbering and this breaking up of the sonnet does is to emphasize ritual, the weeping, the washing of the body, the eating together, the kissing of the hand in the final couplet. And it's interesting that Longley here employs this very long, stately line. This isn't a line of iambic pentameter. If you count the syllables, there are 12 or 13 syllables, so it exceeds the usual 10-syllable iambic line. What's also interesting is that he doesn't rhyme it fully. He rhymes only lines 2 and 4 in the quatrains, doesn't rhyme 1 and 3. But I think even so, the effect of this is to emphasize ritual. And perhaps it means when we reach the rhyming couplet at the end, it's all the more pronounced, culminating in that closing emphasis on what must be done and a strong recognition on the need for forgiveness. Well, I'll move on from here to look briefly at the work of another 2 poets of a slightly later generation. And I think what we'll see in the 2 pieces remaining is a kind of decommissioning, if that's the appropriate word to use, of images and symbols and place names as well that might previously have represented hardened political positions. And both of these poets, Kieran Carson and Paul Muldoon, clearly preoccupied with Irish political history. Obviously, it's an extremely important part of their work, questions of identity and nationality. But both of them destabilizing any fixed or certain viewpoint on these issues. Often they do it by blending history with fantasy, tempering politics with playfulness, generally undermining, in what some critics see as a playful postmodern kind of way, any insistence on fixed or definite positions with regards to Irish political history. Now, the title of Kieran Carson's book, from which this poem 1798 is taken, is The 12th of Never. And this is a case in point to do with the kind of playfulness now. Obviously, the 12th that might come to mind, especially in a Northern Irish context, would be the 12th of July, commemoration of the Battle of the Boyne, and obviously a key date in Loyalist marching, generally on the Loyalist calendar. But this is a volume that upsets those expectations by invoking a different kind of culture, that of popular song. The title, The 12th of Never, refers, as I'm sure many of you know, Derek certainly will know, a song recorded by Johnny Mathis in 1957, The 12th of Never, later recorded by Cliff Richard, and I hate to say it, Donny Osmond as well, but it has those immortal lines, I love you until the poets run out of rhyme, until the 12th of never, and that's a long, long time. So there's a playful invocation of dates and a playful invocation of time. And in a similar way, I think that very stark date, 1798, which seems very fixed as the title of a poem, is undermined as well. It's the date of the Irish Rebellion, great nationalist moment, of course, a lot of nationalist iconography, including the song that I mentioned before, The ballad, The Wearing of the Green, is associated with this. What it does at the same time is to pull away from 1798 in some very strange and bewildering ways. So it's very far from being a simple celebration. The date might seem to suggest, oh, here is yet another poem in praise of the events of 1798, but it's not that kind of writing at all. In formal terms, it's an ashling or dream vision. And I've given you a little note at the bottom of the page with the correct spelling of ashling. It's a very old Irish form in which the speaker has a dream of a beautiful enchantress. Some of you will know of Kathleen na Houlihan in Irish writing, an enchantress who tells the speaker that one day Ireland will be free. And it's a kind of Irish beldame sans merci. The poem follows this model up to a point, but then subtly undermines it, because once again what we've got is a sonnet, and a sonnet that's full of references to Shakespeare, as well as to Irish poetry. So again, at the formal level, in terms of reconciliation, this is not simply an Irish poem at all. It's very much aware of its English predecessors. 1798. I met her in the garden where the poppies grow, quite over-canopied with a luscious woodbine, and her cheeks were like roses, or blood dropped on snow. Her pallid lips were red with papal Spanish wine. Lulled in these wild flowers with dance and delight, I took my opportunity and grasped her hand. She then disclosed the eyelids of her second sight and prophesied that I'd forsake my native land. Before I could protest, she put her mouth to mine and sucked the broken English from my Gaelic tongue. She wound me in her briery arms of eglantine. 2 centuries have gone, yet she and I abide, like emblems of a rebel song no longer sung, or snowy blossoms drifting down the mountainside. Well, one of the sources here, very famous Irish poet called James Clarence Mangan, greatly loved by Yeats and Joyce, both of whom thought he was the major poet of the time, and in particular to a poem called Dark Rosaleen, Russian Doof in Irish, the dark suffering rose. And in that poem, Mangan acknowledges the support of Catholic Spain. Catholic Spain, Catholic France, of course, had come to the aid of Ireland in the 1790s. And there's another poem by Mangan, a ballad, To My Native Land, which is also alluded to. But a lot of the language is Shakespearean, and in fact line 2, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine, is just lifted straight from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the rhyme scheme of the sonnet to begin with is Shakespearean, but then it deviates in the sestet, and as you can see, it avoids a closing couplet at the end. So it's a hybrid kind of poem. But the turn between the octave and the sestet this time, you've got 2 quatrains, 2 tercets here, but the turn very obviously coincides with the kiss of Dark Rosaleen. But that word eglantine is Shakespearean, again from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it implies that she hasn't altogether succeeded in sucking the broken English from the poet's Gaelic tongue. So it's a fascinating poem, I think, that gives us something of the seductive glamour of nationalist iconography, how easily we can be seduced by this luscious language and powerful imagery. But it also, I think, decommissions these emblems as well, as with the reference to the rebel song no longer sung. And what it ends with, I think, is this very delicate Japanese-like image of snowy blossoms in a closing glimpse of peace. And I say Japanese just because I know Kieran Carson was in Japan shortly before he wrote these poems, and lots of interesting references to the sun, to the oriental poppy, all kinds of interesting oriental images start to feed into these poems. But I think the snowy blossom is an image that just subtly cuts against some of these more radical, militant images from the 1790s. Well, I'm going to finish quickly with the poem Hard Drive, the last poem on your handout, which is by Paul Muldoon. And it's from a book called Moy, Sand and Gravel. Now, Moy, Sand and Gravel might suggest a strong attachment to the River Moy in County Armagh, where Paul Muldoon comes from. But as we read the book, it turns out rather mundanely to be the name of a local building company, Moy, Sand and Gravel. And Hard Drive is similarly playful, because at one level I think it's the hard drive of nationalist commitment and struggle, but again, in more mundane terms, maybe the hard drive of computer technology, and maybe what we get here is some strange mechanical computer speak. In many ways, I think this is the quintessential post-ceasefire poem, making light now of the hard drive of which it speaks, and relaxed enough to be playful, even nonsensical in its attitude to the struggle. With a bit of mischief, I think. Hard drive. With my back to the wall and a foot in the door and my shoulder to the wheel, I would drive through Seskinol. With an ear to the ground and my neck on the block, I would tend to my wound in Belleek and Bellinalek. With a toe in the water and a nose for trouble, and an eye to the future, I would drive through Durry Fubble and Dunamana and Ballynaskeen, keeping that wound green. Well, if there is a post-ceasefire sensibility, it can be found here, I think, in the debunking of proverbs and cliches that too often, perhaps, direct the way we behave. And in the playful treatment of place names that, of course, often signify strong territorial possession and belonging. And unlikely as it seems, all of these place names, even Durry Fubble, can be found on a map of contemporary Ireland. But I think their function might well be to make us smile. You know, are these real names, or have they just been made up? Once again, we have a sonnet, but it's a sonnet that seems checked by this incantation of proverbs and place names. The rhymes are all there, but the lines are unusually short. This time it drives straight over the turn, but it does observe the traditional closing couplet. Wildly, I think, outrageously rhyming Ballynaskeen with green. Now, keeping that wound green recalls the wearing of the green, the great ballad from 1798, echoed by Yeats in Easter 1916, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, a terrible beauty is born. Here, it cleverly testifies to both enduring nationalist fervour, keeping the wound green, but I think also to the dangers of a stubborn intransigence in which green might turn to gangrene. There's something very odd and strange and I think infectious about keeping a wound green. Not at all a positive image. The tense of this poem is interesting. It's the habitual past tense, I would tend to my wound, which might imply that such actions, however obsessive and insistent, are now over. Well, I remember Seamus Heaney saying that when you give a lecture, you have to do three things. You have to say what you're going to say, then you have to say it, and then you have to say that you've said what you said you were going to say. And you'd be pleased to know I'm coming up to that third point. So I've said that there's a distinctive change in Northern Irish poetry after 1994, and that this takes a number of forms. There's a lightening, a brightening, a letting in of light, as it were, after 25 years of political darkness, and we certainly see that in the Heaney poems like The Skylight that we've looked at. There's a strong concern with forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a decommissioning of images and icons associated with political conflict. There's a new playfulness, even a sense of mischief. There's a new formal and stylistic freedom and experimentation. And if this looks forward, I think we can say it also looks back. It looks back to some memorable and enduring lines by W.B. Yeats. Irish poets, learn your trade, sing whatever is well made. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you very much. Do you have time for some questions?
Yeah, you do.
Anybody like to raise a question?
Oh dear, watch it.
Right before it, like.
You've got a plant in the audience.
Why did you leave the light on this morning? That's the first question.
Yeah, you've got washing up to do when you get home.
That's a statement, not a question.
An observation, if you will. Thank you so much for that, Stephen. I'm really interested to know, in the years since the 1994 ceasefire, where has Irish poetry gone? Have these Irish poets managed to leave behind their experience of the Troubles, or is it still something that registers and resonates in Irish poetry to this date?
Well, it's very, very diverse, and interestingly, there are differences between the poetry in the Republic and poetry in the North, and there's a whole new generation now taking poetry in a different way, a generation that grew up with different experiences of living in the North, and so different concerns to write about. I would say it's become much more international, and the great thing about Heaney was that two things were happening before he died just a year ago. One was that he'd come back to his place of origin, and a great book called District and Circle, which of course alludes to the London Underground, but it's his own district and his own circling back on his own territory. But he'd clearly by then become such a great international poet, a friend of the great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, poet celebrated in America, living and working at Harvard, writing in the aftermath of 9/11. And the really striking thing as well about the later Heaney is how it's global terrorism, really, that he comes to write about. And having had this experience in his own part of Ireland, you know, supremely well qualified in a lot of ways then to see what's happening on a larger global scale. Yeah, the work of some of his contemporaries is similarly looking out, thinking Derek Mann, for instance, a lot of his work based in America. So it'd be difficult to sum it up, but there's a great diversity and great range. Whereas I think 70s and 80s, the attention of readers and critics was definitely fastened on this as poetry of the conflict. That's what these poets were writing about. If they weren't, often they were criticised for that. But that was the focus of critical interest for a long time, I think. Yeah.
You talked a lot about poets who were generally playful or very accepting and relieved by the ceasefire. Are there any poets you can call to mind who seem bitter?
Oh, that's a good question. Not that I can think of the top of my head, but there's a great poet called Michael Hartnett, who became very dissatisfied with writing in English. Now this is a huge question, because when Yeats was wanting to devise a great Irish nationalist poetry, he was aware that he'd have to do this in English. He didn't have Irish himself, so he famously said, Gaelic is my native language, but it is not my mother tongue. And there was a bit of embarrassment. Someone like Patrick Pearse, of course, you know, led poets and rebels into Easter 1916, wanted a literature in Irish when Ireland eventually got its freedom. And a big part of the debate was to do with the de-Anglicisation of Ireland. So you know, that would have been the extreme radical line, if you like. Now, interestingly, Michael Hartnett, who was writing in the 70s and 80s, got tired of writing in English because he just felt in his blood and his bones that it was a bureaucratic language, it was an administrative language. He didn't really think it was a poetic language, and he has a great line where he says he talks about finding English a necessary sin, the perfect language to sell pigs in. And he gives up writing in English and goes for Irish, knowing that he'll sell far fewer copies of his books, because of course English is an international language. But he's an unusual case, I think. Kieran Carson, whose work we've looked at here, is an Irish speaker who chooses to write in English, but he's fluent in Irish. Heaney had serviceable Irish as well. So maybe that's part of the issue, but I'm not aware of any sort of obvious bitterness of a writing that is still stuck, if you like, in the sectarian conflict, or peddling a kind of sectarian politics. But it's a good question. Naomi.
Can I just respond to that? Is that I don't think there's necessarily bitterness in post-ceasefire poetry either, but there is a sort of post-ceasefire generation that you mentioned. And I think there's more of an embarrassment about so in poets like Leontia Flynn or Sinead Morrissey. So Sinead Morrissey is the poet laureate of Belfast.
Yeah.
They write poems about the touristification of the Troubles and the way that the Troubles are sold as a cultural experience, and that they seem quite embarrassed about that. And are sort of unsure about like the ethics of that as well, I think.
That's good. Yeah. Naomi did a PhD on this topic, and that's a great point. That there's a bafflement and a bewilderment and a difficulty sometimes among this new generation. With very different personal experience growing up in a changed environment.
I think that relates to my question, which is really interesting. I was just wondering, do you think there's any similarities between how America has reacted since 9/11 in their fiction, their poetry, and how Irish poets have reacted since the ceasefire?
Yeah, well, that's really good. I would have said in Irish literature, perhaps with far less drama, or far less emphasis on trauma, with more of an emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation, I think. Not aware of a huge amount of poetry, though obviously in fiction 9/11 has been a massively important subject. Writers like John Updike and others taking it on. You get a sense of a critical emergency situation, great drama surrounding it. Interestingly, some of this work we've been looking at is relatively low key, I think, in comparison.
I have two questions, but just wondering off the back of what Naomi was saying, just where Irish poetry will, Northern Irish poetry will go now. I just know I'm from Northern Ireland, from Portland, and I know we were never taught about the Troubles directly. So I'm just wondering where you think Northern Irish poetry will go in the light of that. Like, I have no actual historical or perhaps unless you were really, your family or you were really involved in it, you will have no real understanding of it. I'm just wondering what your opinion would be, where, like, for instance, people of my generation, what we can write out of and what that'll look like now in a kind of a blank way.
You're probably better qualified than I am in that respect. You know, you have a sense of, you know, what kind of education that there might be now. Just looking at some of the new work coming out, there's definitely a great interest in form, and we've seen here a lot of sonnets, but I think now a willingness to just to write with a new sense of freedom, to play with language. So that's good. You know, I think there's definitely a positive sense of the weight having lifted, or just of not knowing of that so much of that history. But yeah, it would be interesting to see where it goes. We're hoping to get Sinead Morrissey, who won the T.S. Eliot Prize for her work this year, to come to Durham. We did have a booked for Durham Book Festival this year, which wasn't able to come, but she's committed herself to coming next year. So come along to that in Durham if you're still here next year.
And I just have one other question. Just wondering what you think of just take Seamus Heaney to leave in order for him to understand. Just like, I wonder, do you know of the other poets, whether it took them to kind of step back in order to really see the troubles and to see their history from a different angle, maybe see their own place. For instance, like he left Harvard and then became very international. Just kind of the effect of that on his work.
Yeah, so the sense of leaving. Yeah, it's really important, because when he left Belfast, which was in the early 70s, he thought for a moment he'd done the wrong thing. And there's a great poem called Exposure, which is in the book North, where he talks about having missed this opportunity. He doesn't mean in an opportunistic sense that if he'd stayed behind, you know, he wouldn't have the great subject writing there out of the conflict, but just maybe in putting a distance between himself and what was going on in the North. You know, he might have, you know, he might have done the wrong thing as a writer. I mean, the great thing about Heaney is that he agonises over all of these issues. If you look at the book, The Government of the Tongue, his collection of essays, he's got this very moving account of driving through Belfast with a singer, a songwriter called David Hammond, and they're on the way to BBC to record some songs and poems for radio, and a bomb goes off, ambulances, fire engines are zooming all over Belfast, and they decide out of respect to cancel the engagement. Then he thinks about it later, and he thinks maybe that was the wrong thing to do, and that Nero-like, you know, maybe writers and artists just have to keep going, you just have to resist that. So he agonises over those questions of duty and commitment and responsibility. But if you read his interviews, that brilliant book called Stepping Stones has lots of interviews with Seamus Heaney, and he does think that it did him a lot of good to put some distance between himself and Ireland generally, and to meet American poets, to meet poets from Poland and elsewhere, and to learn from them. Whereas Michael Longley has really been the one who's stayed there, you know, throughout the Troubles and after. Kieran Carson's very much a Belfast poet as well. Derek Mann is someone who's travelled a lot, you know, much more cosmopolitan poet. So I think it's, you know, I think it varies from individual to individual, but in Heaney's case, I think it's been very enabling, you know, it's been very fruitful, those contacts with other cultures.
I have a question, but I also wanted to respond to
good.
This time from the Republic. And we used to have discussions kind of about how, like, we did learn about the Troubles, but about how a lot of my generation of writers wouldn't feel they had a right to write about it, because we wouldn't have experienced any of it ourselves. So my parents used to say, like, so different, no idea what
To write about it imaginatively.
Yeah, because also not being from the north.
Yeah,
we would feel like, well, it's just generation, but a lot of people I spoke to really felt that they had much of a right to that part of our history. Well, I just find that interesting.
Yeah, but then, you know, then it is a conflict that affects the whole island of Ireland. And the Irish government, if you read some of the latest history books, I've just been reading a great book by Paul Bew, a Belfast historian, called Ireland, the Politics of Enmity. And he says that it was the pressure that the Irish government put both on London and on Sinn Féin that really helped to kickstart the peace process. The other fascinating thing, I've mentioned this just in passing, of course Marx always said that in the final analysis the economic determinant was the one that would prevail. And it turns out that throughout the 90s up to 94, 95, it was costing the British government £5 billion a year in security. And that put huge pressure on the major government as well. Even though, you know, those governments claimed not to have been doing business with the IRA. I mean, it's now clear they were talking all along. You know, there were secret talks being held. So, you know, it clearly did involve all sides. And I'd be more relaxed about that. I'd say, yeah, it's your, you know, part of your history. Of course.
The question I wanted to ask was just example of poetry you've given is sort of nationalistic approach. And I wasn't you any particular examples that you like of the more nationalist?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it is nationalistic really. I mean, well, you know, for instance, Longley, you know, Longley comes from the Protestant community.
Just means in its imagery.
Oh right, I see. Yes, and some. Yeah, that's true. You know, the wearing of the green and so on. Yeah. Yeah, there are many examples, you know, that we could go to. Derek Mann, interestingly, you know, wrote a lot about the troubles in the 70s, especially, but later hasn't been that involved, not in the way that Heaney and others are. So he's a dog you should look at. Yeah. Was there another question? Yeah.
I was born in Belfast, the daughter of a British Army soldier, and I grew up kind of hearing a lot about the relationship between Kira and the British Army. I was wondering if we have any British voices talking about a ceasefire.
Good question. Do you think in poetry or fiction generally? Yeah, that's a good question. I can't think of any straight off the top of my head. Though, you know, I'm guessing probably there are biographies and memoirs. I imagine some of them written by British soldiers. Yeah, one of the great memoirs I like. It's not written by anyone from outside the north, but Seamus Dean's Reading in the Dark is such a great book, and he writes about the army on the street and the curfew and the experience of living through all of that. But does anyone know of anything by writers from outside either Northern Ireland or the Republic?
Just the new film, 71.
Right.
It was done by British directors.
Yeah. And
it was really interesting insight into what it's like to be a British soldier during the Troubles, posted in Belfast. Yeah, so definitely watch it. It's really good.
Of course, there's also a fantastic novel by Bernard McClavity, but Bernard McClavity lives in Scotland now. But you know, he is from Northern Ireland originally. But he's the author of the novel Cal, which was later filmed. Some of you probably seen that, about a boy who grows up just wanting to be a musician, just wants to play his guitar, but he gets pulled into Republican circles and ends up driving a car involved in an assassination. And it's a brilliant dramatisation of the psychology, the way in which someone young and innocent gets drawn into that, and the film is excellent too. Good.
I wonder if we should draw this to a close. 25 minutes of questions is quite an achievement. So thank you, Stephen, very much indeed. It's good to have somebody from English broadening our insights on forgiveness and reconciliation. Thank you. So I think we should show our appreciation.
Thanks very much, everyone.